I wrote Coming Home for Christmas with my grandchildren in mind, William August, Eliana Bliss, and McKenna Quinn, and all future grandchildren that love storytelling. Nostalgia flooded my mind as I passed by snow-covered fields and tall evergreen trees. I was coming home for Christmas. My thoughts were filled with memories of our farm. I felt a chill as I reflected on waking up before the first light of daybreak on a cold winter morning to feed farm animals and milk our cow Molly. I used to dream about a time when I no longer had to do these chores on freezing winter days. Now looking back, this period of time created some of my fondest recollections. Amid all the hardships and joys, my siblings and I shared responsibilities in the work. My strong work ethic and refusal to give up during tough times were etched into my character during these years on the farm. "We can see the farm, Dad!" Excited voices rang out as my thoughts of being a young boy of 11 faded as I looked over and saw the house now in full view. Sweet aroma of freshly baked bread greeted the children as the door flung open. Grandma was taking cookies from the oven, hurriedly setting down the cookie sheet. Her big smile and open arms greeted 5 excited grandchildren. "Grandma, you made cookies for me!" exclaimed 6-year-old Susan. Everyone was talking at once. "I made enough cookies for all my grandchildren. They will all be here in time for dinner," she said. Seth, who was 4, reached out to snatch a cookie from the table, and Grandma said, "Not before supper." As the grandchildren started for the living room, Seth looked up and saw Grandma's playful smile as she slid a cookie into his coat pocket. A low, rumbling growl came from the living room, followed by a sudden shuffling across the wooden floor, and in seconds, their bigger-than-life grandfather was upon them. Grandpa often acted out the part of a bear, giving the grandchildren quite a chase as they would scamper to get away from him. This time things would be different, for Emily, Susan, and Seth had planned a counterattack, and to the surprise of their grandpa, they met him head-on. Running together, they threw themselves into their grandpa's arms, knocking his hat from his head. "Do you wear all those hats?" Susan exclaimed. Grandpa reached over and took a hat from the rack. "I put a different hat on many times a day," he said with a chuckle. The children all giggled as William picked up Grandpa's hat from the floor. "No time to waste. Let's go exploring," William shouted. William was 12, Emily 10, and Elizabeth was 2 years old. Still wearing their coats and hats, all the children raced through the kitchen, clutching handfuls of cookies as they went out into the snow. They ran to catch up with William, Emily, and Elizabeth, who had entered the smaller barn in search of treasure. Grandpa always hid treasures in hard-to-find places in all the buildings. Grandpa Fred knew how to enjoy his 7 grandchildren, varying in ages from 2 to 14. "Let's make a snowman, Grandpa," Seth pleaded. "Can we do it now?" asked Susan. "Hurry and find a hat and scarf in my closet, for we only have a couple of hours before it's dark out," Grandpa responded. They searched through their grandfather's closet and found the perfect hat and scarf for their snowman. There in the corner of the closet was a small box of coals, perfect for eyes and mouth. Grandpa had considered everything. In the kitchen, they found a bright orange carrot. Grandpa was already outside rolling a big snowball. As the children added their finishing touches, they stood back in near astonishment as their snowman took on lifelike appearance. Why, it looked as much like Frosty as any snowman they had ever seen. Young Seth stood patting Frosty as Tessa, their dog, ran toward Susan. Her snowball hit Tessa directly on the head, but she continued rushing. By supper time, the rest of the family had arrived and they all settled down to a grand feast. A plump roasted chicken from their farm, mashed potatoes and gravy, carrots and green beans made a colorful spread on the table. And you could not miss the aroma of Grandma's homemade rolls. All the children pitched in and did the dishes. Then they settled down to listen to Grandpa read one of his favorite Christmas stories. Elizabeth was snuggled up in Grandpa's arms and fell fast asleep. All the children were up early the next morning, ready for another adventure. While they were looking for new treasures in the big red barn, they spotted a shiny object sticking out from under a tarp, concealing something quite large in the corner. William pulled back the tarp and excited cries burst forth from all the children at the same time. Off the children ran to the house, anxious to hear yet another tale from their beloved Grandpa. There he was, relaxing in his comfortable armchair, with the Bible in his lap, deep in thought. "Grandpa, we found a sleigh in the barn," Emily said with a sort of expression that made you think that the sleigh was lost. Grandpa Fred looked up with a start of surprise at their excited faces. "Why, that was my father's sleigh, and we would use it in the wintertime to travel back and forth to town and church." "Tell us about the sleigh," blurted out Seth. "Did you really have horses take you to town?" asked John. Now they were all asking questions at once. Grandpa Fred smiled, and they caught the twinkle in his eye. "It was 2 weeks before Christmas," Grandpa Fred began. "I had hooked up the sleigh to go out and cut down a Christmas tree. I had turned 12, and Dad said that I was old enough to drive the team without him." "That night," he continued, "darkness came on rather suddenly, and I had to find a tree with little daylight available. After cutting a tree, I tied it over the sleigh and turned to start back home. My Labrador, Tuna, was right next to me when an unexpected gust of wind nearly tore the lantern out of my hand. Without warning, the falling snow turned to a frightening blizzard, and I couldn't make out which direction I was going." "Were you afraid?" asked Susie. "Paralyzed with fear," Grandpa Fred replied. "The horse began to panic, and it was all that I could do to keep him from running into the blackness of the night." Without thinking, young Seth blurted out, "Did you make it back, Grandpa?" Everyone chuckled. "It was hard to see my hand in front of me," Grandpa Fred continued. "I tripped over something in the snow and fell flat on my face. Brr! That snow was so cold. I held tight to the reins, and Tuna stood next to our horse to calm him down. I lay there for what seemed like a long time. Then I remembered something my father had shared with me. God is always with you. You need only ask for his help. It was right there that I told God that I could not make it back without his help. It was the simple prayer of a young boy lost." Tuna was laying in the snow with an "I don't know what to do" look on his face. Abruptly, he lifted his head and began stretching as though he was listening to something far off. I scarcely could hear a piercing sound coming out of the midst of the storm. "Follow the sound, Tuna," I yelled. Immediately, he began to move in the direction of the high-pitched noise. We trudged through the snow for what seemed like hours. I had my doubts, but whenever we veered somewhat out of the path of that very distinct sound, I felt as if we were losing our peculiar guide. I knew that it didn't make sense, but somehow I felt that we were being guided through unknown terrain, and I proceeded to push on into the storm. Finally, when my strength was nearly gone, a gleam of light caught my eyes further down the sloping hills. My strength revived at this welcoming sight, and we plodded forward, my head bent low against the beating snow. Within a matter of seconds, I could see the house in the distance. Why, all the windows in the house were flashing rays of light onto the surrounding landscape, producing the most cheerful and welcoming sight I have ever seen. throughout the years, I have taken many wrong paths because I didn't pay enough attention to details or I attempted to find a shortcut. During these times, I would recall that dark and stormy night and the light streaming out the windows. That has always reminded me how God lights our path so that we might see. Did you figure out what that high-pitched noise was? Interrupted Susan. Bedtime, Grandpa said, and tomorrow I will tell you the rest of the story. Early the next morning, all the grandchildren piled into the back of Grandpa's pickup truck, and Tuna, Keita, and Tessa jumped in, letting the children know that they would not be left behind. Grandma had asked them to cut some holly branches. Look for branches with red berries, she said. At the breakfast table, the children were eager to hear the rest of Grandpa's story. What were those strange sounds, Grandpa? Emily asked. As I was descending the hill, Grandpa Fred answered, I could make out a large white owl against the black sky moving towards our house. Tuna saw it first, for he heard unusual cries coming from the owl long before me. God had answered a small boy's prayer in a way that they would not soon forget. They all clustered near the window and stood looking out upon the snow-covered scene. As they stood gazing out the window, each one could picture one of God's messengers waiting in answer to some other boy's or girl's prayer. Christmas was tomorrow, and the children were having the time of their lives. Treasure hunts, snowball fights, playing games together, grandmas baking and listening to their grandpa tell stories made coming home for Christmas a true celebration and their favorite time of the year. Christmas morning, they were all up early, and a wonderful day greeted them. Gathering around the breakfast table, waiting to exchange presents, the children listened to Grandpa Fred read from his Bible. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulders. Jesus was born into our world to save us from judgment and death, continued Grandpa Fred. Elizabeth, who had slipped away from the table, came running back into the room with an excited voice saying, My Raggedy Ann doll's under the Christmas tree. She's waving at me. Little Elizabeth laid claim to Raggedy Ann, and Raggedy Ann, without exception, followed Elizabeth wherever she went. The best gift the grandchildren would remember in future years was the gift of family. They were thankful for their parents and grandparents who demonstrated an ongoing love and trust in Jesus. Yes, they were happy, and they would never forget that God sent His Son into this world, celebrated on Christmas Day, to bring salvation and eternal life to those who believed in Him. Snow was beginning to fall again, and they all went over and stood at the big window looking out into the yard. Grandpa, shouted William, there's a big white owl in the elm tree. Why, that's a snowy owl, Grandpa said, and it is rare to see one in this area. That is a large male, for the females have more speckled black spots on them. They can get over 2 feet long, and their wingspan is nearly 5 feet. That snowy owl may be of the same family that guided you when you were lost, Grandpa, Susan whispered. As they stood gazing out at the snow owl, their thoughts were filled with joy as they realized that coming home for Christmas was one of the greatest blessings God had given them. Tessa and I are saying goodbye for the moment, but we'll be back to tell more stories.